about this idea of operationalization. I was taught that you've always operationalized your variables.
Okay, I'll explain what I don't like about it. And I'm going to, again, we're going to go back to auxiliary assumptions, but it'll be easier for you to see it if I draw it. Okay, suppose we have a theory, and we believe that X causes Y. Let's make that our theory. Okay? Well, let's say, for example, X is attitude, and that attitude causes intention. Can you observe attitude? No. Can you observe intention? No. Right? So that's not what you never test this. What you might do instead is say something like, well, if I give people a persuasive essay, I'll make this little x, then I might get an effect on responses to my intention questionnaire. Okay, so let's make this little y. So the point I'm trying to make is that little x is observable and little y is observable. Big X is not observable, big Y is not observable. Okay, here's the question that you need to think about. How do you get from big X to little x and from big Y to little y? Okay, answer, auxiliary assumptions. I'll just call this A1 for set 1. Call this A2 for set 2. Right, so you have auxiliary assumptions that link non-observational x to observational little x, and non-observational big Y to observational little y. Mm-hmm. So why don't I like operationalization? Because it's too magical. People say, oh, we got to operationalize, totally missing that you don't just magically come up with little x and little y. You have to have auxiliary assumptions to bridge the gaps.
What would be an example of an auxiliary assumption in the theory that you're...
Okay, so to get from behavioral intentions as a construct to my exact intention measure, I have to assume all kinds of things, such as that the items actually measure intentions and don't measure something else, that participants are being honest, that participants understand the questions. So there are a whole bunch of auxiliary assumptions. We could go on and on. You might even say that an auxiliary assumption, and I'm going to be purposefully ridiculous just to drive it home. It could be that there are aliens with magic powers on Mars watching our study and influencing it. I need to make an auxiliary assumption that that's not true. Right? So,
Thank you. Thank you.
So that's why I don't like operationalization, is because it hides what's really going on, and I hate that. I want researchers to really focus in on auxiliary assumptions. And I might add, by the way, we often talk about the validity of our measures, and we have things like construct validity and so on, which I don't agree with.
Why? How can you not agree with construct validity? I'm on a master's exam, and these students have to recite construct validities. No?
Okay, I'll explain.
Okay.
First, let's agree on what construct validity is, and I'm thinking in the traditional Kronbach and Meal 1955 sense of the word. The idea of construct validity is that your empirical relations match your theoretical relations, right? So here's an empirical relation, here's a theoretical relation, and do they match? Now, of course, you want to have a whole network of these things, so you have a whole network of matching theoretical and empirical relations. And that's the idea of construct validity. What's wrong with it? Doesn't take into account auxiliary assumptions. Suppose that I have ridiculous auxiliary assumptions, but that this connection works. The conclusion, I have valid measures, when I clearly don't have valid measures. So in fact, I've got a publication on this several years ago. I argued for the notion of auxiliary validity as much better than construct validity.
How would you define auxiliary
Validity?
validity? Yeah.
When
We're
I
going to start memorizing this, I want to know.
Okay, yeah, very simply, how good are your auxiliary assumptions? If they're better, then you have good auxiliary validity. If they're worse, then you have poor auxiliary validity. So it's a very straightforward concept, much more straightforward than construct validity, which I think very few people actually understand, even after reading the 1955 paper.
Okay. I'm going to bring it up on the next exam. So what I want to talk about is this relationship of science to storytelling and to statistics. The new Copernican revolution that David Trafimow has brought to science is by looking at the norms of statistics, where you have the p-value, the null hypothesis, these boxes with arrows connecting everything. This idea that we're able to look at the statistical procedures, and if we change those, we're changing the conduct of science. And I believe that that's all in the storytelling of reality. So if we look at what Deleuze has done, and that's my contribution to the video today, the notion of differences in repetitions, we're looking at dynamic behavior of organizational storytelling, or what I call storytelling organization. And by that I mean you have narratives and counter-narratives that are supposedly grand theories of how beginnings, middles, and ends connect in emplotment. You have in storytelling as well the way in which those narratives and counter-narratives erase the dynamics of living stories, webs of living stories, always in the middle, and I'm telling another story in the middle, and another story in the middle, and you're encountering groups of people that are together telling these living stories. And the ensemble leadership work I've done with Grace Ann and others is part of that. So the big area I've been working on is the anti-narrative, which I think relates well to these preparations in advance that are before storytelling of narratives, and before and beneath these narratives and counter-narratives, and between these narratives and living stories. And they are also the anti-narrative bets on the futures. Not just one future, but many futures become possible. And what I really love in the work of Gilles Deleuze is how he develops this notion of the spiral. He does that in this book here on difference and repetition, and he does it on about page 20 and 21, and that's the part I'd like to refer you to. He begins by saying that there is a line, a spiral line, in a geometrical progressing pulsation. However, it's in a living mortal evolution. So he wants to get beyond just a simple line of a spiral to something much more dynamic, I believe. And if you look at how he defines spiral as having left the regularity and repeatability of an exact circle, and now the whirls become more dynamic and become more polyrhythmic as opposed to a single rhythm, and they're work in Deleuze and Guattari continues to develop what I call the anti-narratives of the spiral. Here's the Thousand Plateaus, Capitalism and Schizophrenia. And there they look at these spirals having a double axis of the very paradigmatic and the syntagmatic. These form the axis around which the spirals are happening, and the spirals don't go in a progress direction of some knowledge management spiral, nor do they just go into the downward spiral of escalating conflict until everyone falls into the abyss. Rather, there are both upward and downward spirals, and he, even in the earlier book on difference and repetition, looks at how these have almost a left and a right aspect of the spiraling, as though it had a right and a left in its trajectory. And one of the recent publications I did with colleagues was about the trajectory of spirals. If there are these living movements, and if there's what Deleuze calls a bare material repetition that is isochronic in its relations to nature, then these spirals in principle have variable curves. In other words, you wouldn't just see a spiral like this, you would see a spiral with variable curves and with polyrhythmic forces that are moving both upward and downward. Now that kind of theory I have about spirals, I need to be able to get into the possibility of let's be able to research these spirals, both qualitatively in the order of resemblance that one loop or world in the spiral has to another, and quantitatively in the orders of equivalence that we're using to understand the dynamics of spirals. In the 2016 book, last year, I focused on the fractal aspect of spirals in much of the book, and different kinds of fractals, including the rhizomes. And the Deleuze and Guattari focus in here is on the territorializing, and narratives and counter-narratives are very territorializing. But you also have the deterritorializing effect of living stories and that whole dynamic. And you have re-territorializing in what we call restoring work that Grace Ann Rosale and I work a lot in. So these dynamic rhizomatics, in other words, changes in dynamics that occur in every direction and don't have a paradigmatic or syntagmatic double axis, those gyrations, those lines of flight happen in all directions. But if you look in Deleuze and Guattari, they weren't just talking about rhizomatics in the Thousand Plateaus, they were also talking about how you can jump between the worlds in a spiral and how our interpretation occurs between worlds and between events on the same world. And now we're talking about a kind of interpretation that is so dynamic that I really doubt that we're going to be able to do a very linear approach to science to understand either rhizomes or spiral dynamics. Interpretation I give to double spiral, death spiral, a downward draft, emergent spiral, upward draft, the two opposing forces swirl around a double axis that's paradigmatic themes and syntagmatic discourses. I use the example of the political abyss of many public universities, and I have lines of flight
retirement, people jumping to other universities. There's also movement between the worlds, which has good possibilities for being researched.
David Trafimow's work, because these notions of auxiliary hypotheses, keeping those open so we don't just have the theory of X leads to Y, kind of a beginning, middle, end narrative plot, and then we're trying to operationalize it with some sort of predictive validity and concurrent validity, and we're looking at convergent validity, and the big one, construct validity. Does our test relate back to the theory in any kind of believable face validity way, and does the theory trickle down into these tests and the different kinds of tests and the different groups of people that takes the test, etc. So if we can keep exploring the little a1, the sets, where the big X, that theory cause, and the little x, your construct, and the big Y, your effects, and the little y, that sets of observations that you have in either experiment or in qualitative research, then we can possibly find these dynamics that are happening in the Deleuzian spiral. Talk about the death spiral that many organizations are in, and they're also trying to generate by an emergence an upward or uplift spiral. And these are happening at the same time, and to be able to interpret these worlds, the really interesting thing I'm reading in Deleuze and Guattari's work is how entropy plays out in the spiraling process. And if you don't keep building circles or whorls of involvement so you have continued emergence, then entropy sets in and you have the collapse. The ability to have a line of flight to leave and break out of a spiral, to know when to jump to another organization spiral, upward, downward, left, right movement. The line of flight of retirement, to jump out of a university when its death spiral is intense and its upward emergent spiral is not emerging in the direction that you would want. So that's what I wanted to contribute today, is how this notion of the statistical method, the Copernican revolution there in our norms and procedures, changes the doing of science, possibly makes more longitudinal, more dynamic, complex systems something that can be studied, and that will get us to a better understanding of the dynamics of storytelling and the real. And by real, I mean the production of all those phantasms that are around organizations that aren't going to be picked up in the XY modeling, but could be picked up in the auxiliary assumptions work that David talked about. So thank you.